She had been in the Colorado Territory for 11 days when the man she was supposed to marry died, and nobody in Harlowe seemed to know what to do with her after that. Iris Calloway had come from Cincinnati with a trunk, a sewing kit, and a letter of introduction to one Arthur Brent, rancher, widower, 51 years old. The letter had been arranged through a placement agency on 5th Street that smelled of lavender and practical optimism. Arthur Brent had written twice. Short letters, businesslike, describing the ranch, the elevation, the winters. He had not described himself beyond what was necessary. She had not asked him to. The stage had arrived in Harlowe on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Arthur Brent was dead of a heart seizure that, according to the doctor who had ridden out that morning, had probably been coming for some months regardless of what anyone did or didn't do. Iris learned this from the stage station clerk, a young man named Perry, who told her with the careful, apologetic expression of someone delivering a thing he hadn't been trained to deliver. She had sat with it for a moment in the hard chair by the station window. Outside, Harlowe went about its business in the cold October air. She had 14.60 in her coat pocket, a trunk she couldn't carry alone, and no return ticket. She asked Perry if there was a hotel. There was not a hotel. There was a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Falk, which was close enough. Iris paid for 3 nights, carried what she could from the trunk herself, and spent the first evening taking stock of what she actually had to work with. The situation was not good, but it wasn't nothing either. The Brent Ranch was 2 miles northeast of town. She knew this from the letters. What she learned from Mrs. Falk, over a dinner of salt pork and boiled potatoes, was that the ranch had a foreman named Walt Decker who had worked the place for 7 years, that Arthur Brent had no children and no close family in the territory, and that the property question was currently sitting in the hands of a land attorney in town named Silas Pruitt, who had been Arthur Brent's attorney of record. She also learned, though Mrs. Falk offered this piece last, and with a kind of careful neutrality, that there was a nephew, back east somewhere. Philadelphia, she thought. Or maybe Baltimore. Iris thanked her for dinner, and went to bed and lay in the dark doing arithmetic she didn't much like the results of. In the morning she put on her better dress and went to see Silas Pruitt. His office was above the feed merchant on the main street, single room with 2 windows and more paper on every surface than seemed reasonable for a town of Harlowe's size. Pruitt himself was in his 60s, with a manner that was professionally sympathetic in the way of men who delivered bad news regularly and had learned to soften it without actually changing it. He confirmed what she'd already worked out. Arthur Brent had died intestate. The ranch would pass to next of kin, which in this case was a nephew named Theo Brent, currently residing in Philadelphia. The agency placement was void. There was no legal claim on the property, no financial arrangement that had been finalized, no recourse. She asked about the foreman. Pruitt said Walt Decker was currently maintaining the property until the estate was settled. He said it the way you say something you don't expect to be a useful piece of information. Iris thanked him and went back out into the street. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked at Harlowe. 3 blocks of Main Street, a general store, the feed merchant, the saloon, a small church on the north end, mountains pressing in on the western edge of the valley, close and indifferent. The sky above them, the flat white of a sky, getting ready to do something. She had until Thursday on Mrs. Falk's rate. She went back inside and asked Pruitt if there was any work in town that needed doing. He looked at her over his spectacles with an expression of mild surprise. What kind of work? She told him she could keep accounts, write correspondence, manage filing systems, and had done so for the better part of 4 years in a dry goods firm in Cincinnati before the firm had closed. She said it without embellishment, because embellishment wouldn't have made it more or less true. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he said his filing situation was, in point of fact, a genuine problem, and that he had been meaning to address it for some time. She started that afternoon. The filing situation was worse than a problem. It was a small catastrophe spread across 4 wooden crates and approximately 3 years of accumulated disorder. Iris worked through it with the focused attention she gave to most things that needed fixing, which was to say she didn't hurry it and she didn't complain about it, and by the end of the first day she had a system in place and a clear sense of what was missing and what wasn't. Pruitt paid her fairly, not generously, but fairly, which at this point was what mattered. She was in the office on the 5th day when the nephew arrived. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the stairs, with the particular heaviness of someone who had been traveling for longer than he'd planned and was not entirely reconciled to it. The door opened and Theo Brent came in, and Iris looked up from the filing crate she was sorting, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He was younger than she'd expected. Early 30s, probably, though the road had put some weather in his face. Tall, in a city coat that was good quality but not built for this altitude. Dark eyes that moved around the room with a quick, assessing quality. The eyes of someone who cataloged things automatically. He looked at her. He looked at the filing crates. He looked at Pruitt's desk, which was now considerably more organized than it had been. "Miss?" he said. "Iris Calloway," she said. "I work for Mr. Pruitt." He absorbed this. Then he said, "Theo Brent," and put out his hand. She shook it. She went back to her filing and let Pruitt explain the estate situation, which took the better part of an hour and involved a considerable amount of paper crossing the desk in both directions. She was aware of Theo Brent in the way she was aware of most things, not with particular interest, but accurately. He asked good questions. He didn't pretend to understand things he didn't understand. When Pruitt explained that the property would need to be either sold or actively managed, and that neither option was simple in the current market, Theo sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. She kept filing. Before he left, he stopped near the door and looked at the crates she'd been working through. "That was not in this shape when I wrote to Pruitt last year," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He looked at her with the assessing eyes. "How long have you been in Harlowe?" 8 days, she said. He nodded once, like he was filing that away, and went out. The estate, Pruitt explained to her the following morning, was more complicated than it appeared. Arthur Brent had been carrying a note on approximately a third of the ranch's acreage, borrowed against during a bad year 3 years prior. The note was held by a land company out of Denver called Meridian Holdings. It was current, paid up to date, and had been managed responsibly. But it existed, and a ranch under probate with a mortgage note and an absentee heir was the kind of situation that attracted a particular kind of attention. She asked who held the note specifically. Pruitt told her the name of the company and the Denver address. He said it without particular emphasis. She wrote it down anyway. Theo Brent came back the next day and the day after that. He spent time at the ranch with Walt Decker, who Iris had by then met briefly, a man of few words and considerable competence, who regarded the whole situation with the weathered patience of someone who had worked the land long enough to know that people came and went and the cattle still needed feeding regardless. He came back each evening with mud on his boots and a look in his face that was specific to people encountering a thing larger and more complicated than they'd prepared for. On the 4th evening, he came to the office just before Iris was locking up. He didn't sit down. He stood near the window and looked at Main Street for a moment. Then he said, "My uncle didn't tell me much about the ranch in his letters. I think he thought he had more time to work up to it." She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to that. He turned from the window. "Pruitt says you had an arrangement to come out here." "Through the agency, yes." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry for how it turned out." She received that the way she received most things, directly without deflecting. "Thank you." He was quiet. "Then, you're staying on, then, in Harlowe, for the time being," she said. He looked at the filing crates, now nearly resolved into order. "Do you know anything about ranch accounting?" She told him she knew general accounting principles, had managed the books for a dry goods operation with 12 suppliers and fluctuating seasonal inventory, and was reasonably confident she could learn what was specific to a cattle operation in a short time. She said it the way she said most things, which was flatly and without prettying it up. He looked at her for a long moment, not appraisingly, not the way some men looked at her that made her want to take a step back. More the way you look at a bridge when you're not sure whether it will take the weight. "I need to decide what to do with this property," he said. "I can't make a good decision without accurate books. Walt knows the cattle and the land. He doesn't know what's on paper." She waited. "I'm not offering you a permanent position," he said carefully. "I can't until I know what the permanent situation is. But I can pay you for honest work, and I won't waste your time." Those were words she recognized. She had written something close to them herself once, in a letter to an agency in Cincinnati. "I am not looking for charity. I am looking for honest work in exchange for fair pay." "All right," she said. The ranch books were, as it turned out, not in good shape. Not through any dishonesty, just the gradual accumulation of a man handling things alone who was better with cattle than columns. She spent 3 days at the kitchen table in the ranch house, going through the ledgers while Walt moved through the property outside, and Theo sat across from her with his city coat, now exchanged for something more practical, reading through the correspondence she pulled from the files. She did not talk much while she worked, neither did he. This turned out to be compatible. On the third evening, she found the discrepancy. It was in the note payments. Meridian Holdings had been receiving monthly payments accurately recorded. But the payment amounts in the ledger didn't match the amounts specified in the original note agreement. Small differences. Not errors, she thought, looking at the pattern. Not the kind of difference that drifted in by accident. The kind that was entered carefully and consistently by someone who knew what they were doing. She set the two documents side by side and looked at them. Then she went to find Theo. He was on the porch, which she had learned was where he went in the evenings when the inside of the house, which still held all of Arthur Brent's particular presence, felt like too much. He looked at the two documents she put in front of him without speaking and took his time reading them. The porch was cold. Neither of them mentioned it. The payment amounts are different, he said. By $11 a month, she said, for 31 months. He did the arithmetic. That's $341. Yes. He looked up from the papers. Can that happen by accident? Not this consistently, she said. Not in this direction. Always under? Always under. The ledger payments are lower than the note specifies. He was quiet for a moment. His hands on the papers were still. So either my uncle was underpaying the note without knowing it, or someone was recording payments below what was actually sent. She had been thinking about this for the last 20 minutes. Both of those are possible, she said. The third option is that the note agreement was modified at some point, and the modified version isn't in these files. He looked at her. If the note was modified and not filed properly, she said, the original terms might still be what Meridian considers current, which would mean 31 months of underpayment on record. What does that mean for the estate? It means they could call the note, she said carefully, if they wanted to, on grounds of breach. He looked back at the mountains for a moment. Dark was coming down from the peaks, filling the valley from the top the way it did out here. She had noticed that about Colorado. The dark came from above, not from the horizon, which was the opposite of Ohio. Does Walt know about this? He said. I don't know what Walt knows about the finances, she said. I haven't asked him. Theo folded the papers and handed them back. Ask him, he said. Tomorrow. Walt knew something. It turned out, though not everything. He knew that Arthur Brent had received a visitor from the Denver office of Meridian Holdings about 4 months ago. A representative named Aldous, well-dressed, had stayed 2 days and had left with a set of documents Arthur had signed. Walt had not seen the documents. Arthur had not explained them. Walt had mentioned, afterward, that Arthur had seemed quieter than usual for a week or two, and then had appeared to put it behind him, and Walt, being a man who respected the line between ranch business and paper business, had not asked. Iris asked if the visitor had left any copies behind. Walt thought about it. He said he thought there might be something in the desk in the front room, in the locked drawer. The locked drawer required Pruitt, who had the key as part of managing the estate. Pruitt came out the following morning with the key and his careful professional manner and unlocked the drawer, and inside was a single folded document. Iris read it first because she was standing closest, and she read quickly. Then she handed it to Theo without a word and watched his face while he read it. The document was a modification to the note agreement. It reduced the monthly payment amount by $11 and extended the note term by 18 months. It was signed by Arthur Brent. It was also signed by Aldous Crane, Regional Director, Meridian Holdings. It was dated 8 months ago. It was not filed with the county. Theo looked up from the document. This should have been filed. Yes, she said. Is there a reason it wasn't? She thought about that carefully, about the shape of things, the pattern she'd been seeing in the payment records and now in this document, about the visitor who had come and gone and left Arthur Brent quiet for 2 weeks. The modifications benefits your uncle, she said. Lower payments. He had reason to keep a copy and reason to want it on record. The only party with a reason not to file it was Meridian. Theo looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's expression had gone from careful professional to something more careful still. I was not informed of this modification, he said. I should have been. If they call the note on grounds of breach, Iris said, and this document doesn't exist on record, there's no defense. The modification that authorized the lower payments is in this desk drawer and nowhere else. Pruitt sat down heavily in the chair by the window. The picture that assembled itself over the next 2 days was not a simple one, but it had a shape Iris recognized from 4 years of watching how paper moved through a business, and what happened when it moved in the wrong direction on purpose. Meridian Holdings had been buying ranch land in the San Luis Valley for the better part of 2 years. 3 properties had sold in the last year alone, each under a mortgage note held by Meridian, each sale following a dispute over payment terms. The pattern was in the property records at the county courthouse, which Iris spent a day going through while Theo rode the property lines with Walt, and came back with a look she was starting to recognize. The look of a man who had not expected to care about something, and was discovering that he did. She told him what she'd found over dinner, which had become a functional habit. The 2 of them at the kitchen table with the food Walt's wife sent over from their place down the road, and the papers between them. 3 sales, she said. Same pattern. Note called, breach cited, settlement fast, land transferred inside 60 days. He looked at the property records she'd laid out. What's the common factor? Meridian holds the note in each case, she said. And in each case, the call came just before the property would have qualified for the federal grazing allocation. He looked up. The allocation survey goes through the valley in January, she said. Properties with clean title and 3 years of active cattle operation qualify for the federal grazing lease on the eastern mesa. It's worth considerably more than the land itself. Theo set down his fork. My uncle's property. Qualifies, she said, if the title is clean and the operation is intact at survey time, which is January, which is in 11 weeks. He looked at the mountain through the kitchen window, the dark bulk of it against the last thin line of evening light. Walt told me this land is some of the best in the valley, he said. Walt is right. He was quiet for a long time. When he looked back at her, there was something settled in his face, a decision arriving rather than being made, the way decisions sometimes worked. He asked, "What do we do?" She had been thinking about that since the day she found the first discrepancy. "We file the modification," she said. "Today, if possible. We get that document on public record where it belongs, which closes the breach claim. We request a formal accounting from Meridian of all payments received against the original note terms, which they're required to provide to any estate in probate. And we find out whether what they're doing is limited to this property, or whether it's a pattern that someone with authority would be interested in knowing about." What kind of authority? She thought about the federal allocation survey. "Federal," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You've been working this out since the payment ledger." She had been working it out since the locked drawer. She had been suspicious since the payment ledger. "I wanted to be sure of the shape of it before I said anything," she said. He nodded, not the approving nod of a man crediting a woman for unexpected competence, just the nod of someone who understood working a problem until you were sure of it before you named it. They rode into Harlowe the next morning before the courthouse opened. Walt came with them, which he offered without being asked, and she understood from the way he positioned himself near Theo, on the courthouse steps, that he had his own sense of what was at stake. Pruitt was already there. Whatever Pruitt's original instincts about Meridian had been, the picture she'd assembled had reorganized them, and he was now operating with the energy of a man who had been made to look incapable and intended to correct the record. The modification document was filed within the hour. The formal accounting request went out to Meridian's Denver office the same day. Pruitt, in a move she had not suggested but approved of, sent a separate letter to the federal land office in Denver, noting the pattern of sales and payment disputes in the valley, and requesting that the January allocation survey include a review of title circumstances for the affected properties. That letter, she thought, was the one that would matter most. That was the one that made Meridian visible to someone with the authority to look at them directly. They were back at the ranch by noon. She sat at the kitchen table, with the ledger she'd been reconstructing, and listened to Theo and Walt talking on the porch in the low, specific way of men discussing what needed doing before winter, and she wrote the numbers down in the corrected columns, and the sound of that conversation came through the window like something functional and solid. On the second night after the filing, they received a visitor. The rider came at dusk, which was the hour people chose when they wanted to arrive, after the day's business was settled, but before the cover of full dark made the intent too obvious. He was a young man, neatly dressed, with a company manner about him, the kind of manner that had been trained on rather than grown naturally. He said his name was Harker, that he was representing Meridian Holdings, and that his employer wanted to extend a good faith offer to resolve the estate matter directly. Theo received him on the porch. Iris stood in the doorway. The offer, Harker explained with practiced smoothness, was a purchase price for the ranch property, straightforward, at a figure he named that was approximately 40% below the land's actual value. In exchange, Meridian would clear the note, handle all probate complications that would allow Mr. Brent to return to Philadelphia without further inconvenience. Theo let him finish. Then he said, "No." Harker adjusted. The offer was, he said, adjustable, within reason. "No," Theo said again. Harker looked past him at Iris in the doorway with the particular quality of attention that meant he was reassessing who was doing what in this situation. She looked back at him without expression. "The modification on the note has been filed," Theo said. "The payment history has been requested, and the Federal Land Office has been made aware of the pattern of transactions in this valley over the last 2 years." He said it without heat, just the plain facts lined up in order. "If your employer would like to discuss something, he's welcome to do it through Pruitt's office, with the relevant documents on the table." Harker was quiet for a moment. His trained manner had gone slightly off, the way trained things went when they encountered something they hadn't been prepared for. He put his hat back on, said good evening, and rode back down the trail. Walt, who had been somewhere in the barn shadow during the whole exchange, materialized at the corner of the house after the sound of hooves faded. "Might want to keep an eye on things tonight," he said. "Yes," Theo said. They watched in shifts. Nothing came of it. In the morning, the property was as it had been, and a frost had come down from the peaks overnight that turned the grass silver and put the first real cold in the air. The cold with intention, the kind that was getting ready to be serious. Iris was at the table with the ledger when Theo came in from the early rounds. He poured coffee and sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a while, which had become comfortable in the way that working alongside someone closely for 2 weeks produced a particular kind of quiet. She said, eventually, without looking up from the column she was working, "You could sell. The offer was below value, but you could negotiate it. It would close everything out cleanly." He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was looking at the window, at the frost on the glass and the white light of the early morning coming through it. "Walt has been here 7 years, he said. She waited. His wife. Their 2 kids are in the school in Harlowe. His older boy works the property with him. She understood what he was saying. She went back to the column. "My uncle spent 30 years on this ground," Theo said. "He wasn't good at letters. He wasn't good at explaining things. But he wrote me twice a year without fail, and he always mentioned Walt and the cattle and what the winter had been like." He looked at the table. I think this place was the thing that made sense to him, even toward the end when it was hard. She finished the column and turned the page. "The allocation survey is 11 weeks, she said. "If you're going to hold it, the title needs to be clean and the operation needs to be demonstrably active. Walt can do the operation. The title is what we're working on." He looked at her. "Do you think Meridian will push further?" She thought about the pattern of sales. "I think they'll try the documentation route again before they try anything else. They're a company, not outlaws. They're used to things resolving on paper. If the paper closes against them cleanly," she paused, "they'll look for easier ground somewhere else." He drank his coffee. Then he said, "When this is settled, one way or another." "What do you want to do after?" The question caught her off guard, which was unusual. She was not often caught off guard. She set her pen down. She had not thought past the immediate problem in a considered way. She had thought about it at the edges, the way you thought about things you weren't ready to look at directly. Cincinnati had nothing to bring her back to. The agency was a door she'd walked through in one direction. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. He looked at the window again. "Do you like it here?" She thought about that. The mountains. The particular quality of the light at altitude. The cold that was coming, serious and large, the kind of cold she didn't know yet, but could read like a problem she hadn't fully worked through. Walt and his wife, who sent food and expected nothing for it. Harlowe's 3 blocks of Main Street, and Pruitt's disordered filing and the desk where she worked every morning now. She looked around the kitchen. At the ledger she'd spent 2 weeks putting right. at the window and what was outside it. I think I could, she said. Like it here. Theo looked at her across the table. He had the careful expression of a man who had arrived for one thing and found himself in the middle of something he hadn't planned for and was working out how he felt about it. All right, he said. She went back to the ledger. The response from Meridian's Denver office arrived 12 days later, carried by a rider who came in the early afternoon and handed the envelope to Pruitt with the neutral expression of a man paid to deliver and not to interpret. It was not a concession. It was a formal notice of breach claim, citing the underpayment record as grounds to call the note, referencing the original agreement terms, and demanding full settlement of the outstanding balance within 30 days, or the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. The notice did not mention the modification document. It proceeded as though the modification did not exist. Iris read it twice. Then she read it again. She handed it to Theo. He read it, his face settling into the expression she had come to read as his working face, the quiet, focused look of someone thinking rather than reacting. They went to Pruitt. Pruitt, to his credit, had been expecting something like this and had been preparing. He had a copy of the filed modification on his desk. He had the recording confirmation from the county clerk. He also had, which surprised Iris slightly, a letter from a colleague in Denver named Whitmore, who specialized in territorial property disputes and who had reviewed the situation and the meridian pattern at Pruitt's request. Whitmore's letter was 6 pages, precise, and made several observations about Meridian Holdings' conduct across 3 counties that suggested the pattern in the San Luis Valley was not isolated. The letter also noted that a formal complaint to the territorial attorney's office would find the documentation Pruitt had assembled unusually complete for a complaint of this kind. Usually, Whitmore wrote, these cases fall apart because the aggrieved party doesn't have the records in order. Yours are in excellent order. Iris felt something at that, a brief, quiet satisfaction she put away before it became anything larger. There was still work to do. The response to Meridian's breach claim took 4 days to prepare, because she and Pruitt and Whitmore's written counsel prepared it carefully. It cited the filed modification, the recorded date, the payment history recomputed against the modified terms, which showed not breach but perfect compliance for 31 months. It noted that Meridian's claim rested on a document superseded by the modification. It further noted that the pattern of similar claims in the Valley had been referred to both the federal land office and the territorial attorney for review. Theo signed the response. He read every page before he signed it. When Pruitt submitted it, there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting on a cattle ranch in November was, it turned out, not the same as waiting anywhere else. There was no hour of the day without something that needed doing. Iris had stopped thinking of herself as a temporary presence in the ranch house by then, though she had not examined that change too closely. She had simply started doing the things that needed doing, and the things that needed doing had expanded to include more than accounting. She helped Walt's wife, whose name was May, put up the last of the root vegetables for winter storage. She learned, in the particular way of learning things by doing them wrong first, how to bank a fire so it lasted through the night without going out. She mended what needed mending. She made a systematic inventory of the food stores, identified what would run short before the pass cleared in spring, and gave Theo a list of what needed to come up from Harlowe before the serious snow. He looked at the list. Then he looked at her. You've been thinking about spring, he said. She had been thinking about winter, she said. Spring was the conclusion you reached if you were thinking about winter correctly. He took the list to Harlowe the next morning. The territorial attorney's response came before Meridian's did. A deputy attorney named Carrington arrived in Harlowe on a Tuesday, rode out to the ranch on Wednesday, and spent 3 hours at the kitchen table, with Iris and Pruitt and Whitmore's letter going through the documented pattern of Meridian's operations across the valley. He was a compact, deliberate man who wrote constantly in a small notebook and asked precise questions, and appeared entirely unimpressed by anything except the quality of the documentation, which he commented on once, briefly, and not to her specifically. Whose work is this? He asked Pruitt, meaning the organized filing, the recomputed payment history, the cross-referenced property records. Pruitt looked at her. Carrington looked at her. She said, I managed Mr. Pruitt's files and the ranch accounts. The property records at the courthouse are public. He wrote something in his notebook. He asked 3 more questions directly to her before the end of the meeting, about the sequence of the modification discovery, about the meridian pattern across properties, about the timing relative to the federal allocation survey. She answered all 3 precisely and without editorializing. After Carrington left, Theo stood on the porch looking at the trail where the deputy had ridden out. Walt was beside him. Iris stood in the doorway. "Do you think it's enough?" Theo said. She thought about Carrington's notebook, about the questions he'd asked, about the fact that he'd asked 3 of them to her directly after asking the first one to Pruitt. "I think he came here because the complaint was documented thoroughly enough that he had to," she said. "What he does with it depends on things I can't see." She paused. "But the allocation survey is still in January, and we're still here." Walt made a sound that was his version of agreement and went back to the barn. Meridian's response to the breach claim reply came 11 days later. It withdrew the notice, not with acknowledgement, not with explanation. Simply withdrew it in a letter of 3 sentences that said the matter was under internal review, and the notice was suspended pending that review. The foreclosure proceedings were not initiated. Pruitt called it a retreat. Whitmore, who received a copy, wrote back that it was the response of a company that had looked at the documentation and decided the ground was less favorable than expected. Iris thought it was the response of people who had done the math and found that the cost of continuing was now higher than the likely return. She knew that math. She'd watched it operate from both directions. They were sitting at the kitchen table again when Theo told her. Walt and May were in the front room. May had brought pie, the way she brought things when something was worth marking, without quite saying so. He put the letter on the table, and she read it and put it down. "So," he said. "So," she said. They were both quiet. Outside the window, the November dark had come down early the way it did at this elevation, and the lamp put a warm circle on the table between them and the papers that had been their shared occupation for 6 weeks. "I've been thinking," Theo said, "about staying." She looked at him. "I have work in Philadelphia," he said carefully. "I'm not pretending I don't. But Walt has 7 years in this land and no reason to stay if the property goes to a stranger. And the allocation survey is in 6 weeks, and after that the lease is worth more than the sale price would have been." He looked at the papers on the table, at the ledger she'd reconstructed, the clean columns, the corrected record. "I'm not good at ranching," he said. "I know that. I know it clearly after 6 weeks of watching Walt work. But I'm not useless either. I learn things." He paused. "And the books need someone who knows what they're doing." She said nothing, waiting. "I'm asking if you'd stay," he said. "Not just through the survey. Staying." She looked at the window, at the dark outside it and the mountains she couldn't see but knew were there. She had been in Colorado for 7 weeks. She had come for one reason and found herself in the middle of something else entirely, which was either terrible luck or the other kind. "The work is real," she said. She was not asking it as a question. "The work is real," he said. She thought about Cincinnati, about the agency office with its lavender and optimism, about the trunk still partly packed in Mrs. Falk's back room, which she had been paying to store, and which she had not gone back to because there was nothing in it she'd needed. What would this arrangement look like, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Practical," he said finally. "To start. Honest work, honest pay, honest ground to stand on. And then, if it became something else, we'd say so, to each other, directly." She looked at him across the table. He had the watchful eyes and the careful manner of a man who had learned not to promise more than he could deliver, and she recognized that quality the way you recognized something you'd developed yourself. "All right," she said. He nodded. He picked up the Meridian letter and set it with the other filed papers exactly where it belonged, which was somewhere in the middle of a record that was now complete. Walt knocked on the doorframe from the front room. "May says the pie's going cold," he said, with the studied neutrality of a man who had been listening to exactly none of this. They went in. The federal allocation survey came through in January, on a bright, cold morning, with the kind of sky that Colorado produced in winter when it wasn't snowing, hard blue, so clear it looked like something that would shatter if you hit it. The surveyor rode out from Harlowe with a federal deputy and a young man with equipment who spent 4 hours walking the eastern mesa and taking measurements while Walt explained the operation, and Theo answered questions about title history. And Iris sat at the kitchen table and produced, when asked, every document in the correct order. The lease allocation was confirmed 3 weeks later. The territorial attorney's investigation into Meridian Holdings' practices across the valley continued into the following spring. 2 properties were reviewed. One family recovered land they had sold under pressure the previous year. It was a slow process, and not everything was recovered, and some things that had gone wrong stayed wrong the way some things did. But the Brent property held. The cattle went through the winter and into spring with Walt's competent management, and Theo's increasingly practiced help. The books were accurate. The record was clean. Theo stayed. He wrote to Philadelphia and arranged his affairs there, and they were arranged. And that was that. They were married in April, in Harlowe, in the courthouse, with Pruitt as witness, and Walt and May, and their boys standing outside in the spring air after, with the mountains still carrying snow on their upper faces, and the valley below them, starting to show the first thin green. It was a short ceremony. They had both said what they meant to say already, at the kitchen table, in the paperwork, in the 6 months of honest work and honest difficulty that had made the ceremony less a beginning than a confirmation of something already in place. Walt shook Theo's hand and looked at Iris and said, "Good, just that, the way a man says the precise thing and leaves it there." May, who had been feeding 2 people who did not ask to be fed, but clearly needed it for 6 months, hugged Iris once, briefly, and didn't say anything at all. The spring came up the valley the way it always did, not all at once but in arguments, cold days and warm ones, snow that came back twice after everyone assumed it was done. Then one morning in early April the air had a different smell, something green underneath the cold, and the creek running high with snowmelt, and Iris stood in the yard of the ranch house. That was now her house, in the plain factual way that houses become yours through the accumulation of ordinary days, and she breathed it. She had come to Colorado in October, with a trunk and a letter, and $14.60. She had come for a life that had been pulled out from under her before it started. What she had found instead was not simpler or easier or warmer than what she'd expected. It was harder in most of the ways that mattered. It was also more real, in all of them. The work was honest. The ground was honest. The man she'd married was exactly what he appeared to be, which was rarer than it sounded, and worth more than she'd known to look for. She went inside. Theo was at the table with the spring planting records Walt had brought over, and the coffee was on, and the lamp was lit against the early morning gray. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him and picked up her pen. Outside, the valley was waking up into another day that would ask something of everyone in it. On this ranch, in this particular patch of Colorado ground, there were 2 people ready to answer. That was, she had found, exactly enough.